Hello, everyone. Good morning, and you are very welcome to this YouTube channel. In this playlist, we are going to be learning all about object oriented programming. But first of all, we would need to understand what object oriented programming is and what procedural programming is. So, let's get started. So, in today's session, we'll be looking at two things: procedural programming and object oriented programming. So, first of all, let's start with procedural programming. So, what does it mean by procedural programming? So, by the word procedure, you would understand that procedural programming is just giving a certain set of steps to follow. So, in procedural programming, we have procedures, which we also call them as functions. And if you have done C programming, you should know about functions. Some other languages call them routines, some call them subroutines. And these functions consist of series of computational steps that are carried out by that particular programming language. So if you write it in C programming, you are simply going to be writing series of functions, series of steps that are taken by that particular function to perform a certain task. So that is procedural programming. Now, what is object oriented programming? So simply, it's a programming model that follows the concept of objects. So the two mentioned concepts are all concepts. Procedural programming is a concept, object oriented programming is also a concept. But when it comes to object oriented programming, we follow the concept of objects. And when it comes to procedural programming, we follow the idea of functions or the idea of steps. Okay, so now let's look at some key differences between procedural programming and object oriented programming. So when it comes to procedural and object oriented, some there are many differences, but we'll be looking at these four main differences because these differences really highlight upon the importance of object oriented programming. So division of program. So in object oriented programming, programs are divided into what we call objects. So in object oriented programming, we simply want to represent real world objects in code. So an example could be a bank account with the name of the account user and other details of the account user, which is different from someone else's bank account, even though they all have features like having a name and having an account number. It is sort of related to a person, so sort of an object, and that is what object oriented programming is about. When it comes to procedural programming, it is not related to objects, it's rather related to procedures, that is, steps that will be used in solving a problem. So, that is one key difference between object oriented programming and procedural. When it comes to the next point, approach, the approach that procedural programming takes is by using what we call steps or functions or subroutines in solving a problem. Then for object oriented programming, it uses what we call objects, and sometimes we call them classes. Classes are just blueprints upon which objects are created. So the approach is different for the two different concepts that we are looking at. Then when we come to orientation um is the same idea as the two above. um Procedural programming is oriented around procedures, so everything you do is just um will be around solving what a problem or giving some certain steps towards solving a problem. Then for object oriented programming, it all boils down to what? objects. So some properties, some methods that are related to a particular object. Let me give you an example. So the bank account example that I gave earlier. So every bank user or someone with an account will have a name, and then someone with an account should have an account number. Then that person should also be able to withdraw from that account, and that is how orientation is. It is orienting around an object and its properties and methods. So that is one key thing. Then, and the last point is data hiding. That is one of the most important points that we should take note of. When it comes to procedural programming, data, as in let's say integers or strings or things that we use to represent data in procedural programming, are not hidden. They are exposed, and that is one main thing that we don't want our code to do. Because if you are exposed to people who can hack your system, they will just simply take that data and then use it against you. So an example is the bank system. So the banking system, everyone with an account must have its account number hidden and the account details hidden, right? But when you are using procedural programming, then you are actually exposing this data to the fraudsters, the people who would probably use this data to get money from these people's account. But when it comes to object oriented programming, it all boils down around objects and classes. So what it simply means is every object will have its own properties and its own methods, which are hidden within that object, so no one else can actually access that object. Do we get the idea? So the idea of object oriented programming is all about security, like data hiding. Hide the data from other people, from people that will be attacking or that will be hacking the system. So that is one key difference between object oriented programming and procedural programming. So let me highlight on the things that we'll be really treating in object oriented programming. So when it comes to object oriented programming, we have four main concepts that we'll be looking at. The first is abstraction, second, encapsulation, third, inheritance, and fourth, polymorphism. So I'll just give some short, brief explanation on each of them. So when it comes to abstraction, what does it simply mean? Abstraction is when you hide implementation details and show the relevant details to a user. An example is anytime you buy a DVD player, you will notice that the buttons are provided at the front side of the DVD player. When you press on open, when you press on play, when you press on off, you would see that actions are being taken. But do you ever imagine how those actions are being taken? And that is what we call abstraction. Those actions are within the DVD player itself and they are hidden from your sight. Let me give a more realistic example that we always come across. An example is the let's say going to a page and logging into a page. So let's say KNUSC page student portal, you log into your student portal. In logging in, you get to access what we call the form, the login form. You provide your details and that is where you are logged on. So anytime you provide the details, you press on submit. Have you ever imagined how those kind of how the system does it to bring you to a login page, like your credentials are processed and then it brings you to a page, your own profile page? Have you ever imagined? So that is what abstraction is about. The details of making you go into your profile page is hidden from you. It is written by the backend developer, but you don't see it. What you only see is what the front end developer provides for you. So that is abstraction. When it comes to encapsulation, it is simply also related to hiding. So encapsulation means encapsulating, like engulfing something that belongs to you to show that this belongs to me. It is sort of related to what we call global and local variables in procedural programming languages like C programming, but it is different. This one is a concept that makes things be, let's say, related to a particular class. So if a class or an object has a particular property, that property is encapsulated by that particular object, which means um, no other object can have that set of properties. So what is in addition, I could explain that when it comes to procedural programming, you have names of data types. You can't give the same name for some data types. Like if you would want to use two data types, you have to give them separate names. But when it comes to object oriented programming, you can use similar names in objects so far as the names have been engulfed by a particular object and is different from another object. That object assumes that that property or that method or that data type belongs to it and not to the other one. So naming conflicts are prevented. Now let's look at inheritance. Inheritance is simply the one that we know about, inheriting from what? Parent. So that is the same thing here. It prevents what we call um, repetition of code. So it encourages code reusability. So in a way, you write one code and that code is shared by um, other parts of your code, and that is why object oriented programming is one of the preferred concepts in most programming languages. And please take note, object oriented programming is not a programming language, it's just a concept that most programming languages implement. So let's take note of that. So inheritance allows us to what? Reuse code and prevents repetition of code. Then the last thing on the list is polymorphism. So when we say polymorphism, poly simply means many, and morphism simply mean, or morph simply means forms. So many forms. So in object oriented programming we have polymorphism, which simply means that you can have one function, let's say a function that does something. Let me give you a good example. So a function that let's see, a function that prints something out to a user. Okay, that function can be provided with what we call string, or it can be provided with multiple strings, but at the end the function still provides you with an output. What I simply want to say is that polymorphism can be defined as, let's say, one function that can take multiple inputs. Okay, it can either take one or more than one input, or sometimes the function could just not take any input and the name of the function remains the same. That kind of idea cannot be implemented when it comes to procedural programming, because procedural programming requires you to either not give the function an input, or you either give it one input or two inputs. And functions in procedural programming cannot have the same name with different inputs. That will be an error. And I know most of you who have used C programming know about this idea. So that is um, polymorphism. So that is it for this tutorial. And next time we'll be building up on these concepts: abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, and polymorphism. And as you know, we'll be using the um, Java language in treating object oriented programming. Thank you, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Bye.